Was that a wolf?
In 2019, a solo hiker vanished in the Alaskan wilderness, and the only thing left behind was 14 minutes of bodycam footage that nobody can explain. The final frame shows a massive shadow standing upright between the trees before the recording cuts to black. The official report says wolves. The footage says something else entirely. What makes this case different from every other missing person file in Alaska is what investigators found when they went looking for him. There was no body, no blood, no sign of a struggle, just tracks in the snow that should not exist, and claw marks in the bark that no known animal in North America could have made. The hiker was an experienced outdoorsman in his late 30s who had spent years logging solo trips across some of the most remote terrain in the state. He was not reckless. He filed trip plans. He carried proper gear. He checked in with his family on a satellite phone every 48 hours like clockwork. His route that November took him deep into a stretch of backcountry northeast of Denali, an area known mostly for its isolation and its brutal early winter conditions. He planned a 6-day loop through valleys that saw almost no foot traffic after September, the kind of country where a person could walk for days without seeing another soul. He made his first check-in on schedule. His second check-in, due on the morning of day 4, never came. His family waited 12 hours before contacting authorities. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. The initial search lasted 5 days. Teams covered his planned route by air and on foot, scanning for any sign of the hiker or his gear. They found his base camp on day 2, a well-organized site near a frozen creek bed with his tent still standing and his food cache properly hung. His pack was inside the tent. His satellite phone was there too, powered off but functional. The only things missing were the clothes on his back, his boots, and the body cam he always wore, clipped to his chest strap when hiking. Everything else was left behind in perfect order. The rangers on the ground made an early assumption that wolves had gotten to him. The area had a known pack that had been tracked by wildlife biologists for several seasons. There had been a few reports of aggressive behavior toward hikers in recent years, nothing fatal but enough to put it on the radar. The theory was simple. He stepped out of camp at night, maybe heard something, maybe needed to relieve himself, and the pack caught him in the open. It was clean. It was logical. It checked the boxes that needed checking, except nothing at the scene actually supported it. There was no blood anywhere near the camp, no drag marks, no torn fabric, no scattered gear. When a wolf pack takes down prey, it is not a quiet event. There are signs everywhere: fur, blood, disturbed ground, tracks converging from multiple angles. None of that was present here. The snow around his camp showed his boot prints leading away from the tent in a single line heading northwest into the tree line. The prints were steady and evenly spaced. He was walking, not running. There was no indication of panic in his stride. And then the prints just stopped, not faded, not buried under drift. They stopped in the middle of a clearing about 400 yards from camp, as if he had simply ceased to exist. The snow beyond was untouched. No tracks leading away, no drag marks, no impressions of any kind. The rangers stared at that clearing for a long time, and none of them had a good answer for what they were looking at. One of the veteran rangers later admitted privately that in 22 years of search and rescue in Alaska, he had never seen anything like it. Tracks do not just end. People do not just vanish from the middle of an open clearing. The body cam was found 3 weeks later by a separate team doing a secondary sweep of the area. It was sitting on a rock beside the frozen creek, roughly 2 miles from the base camp and nowhere near the clearing where the boot prints ended. The camera was intact, the housing undamaged, and the battery completely drained. When they charged it and pulled the footage, 14 minutes of recording remained on the memory card. The timestamp placed it on the night of day 3, roughly 12 hours before his second check-in was due. What that footage contained would eventually reach a very specific group of people in a very quiet office. The rangers who first viewed the footage did not know what to make of it. The senior ranger on duty watched it 3 times in a row, then called his supervisor. The supervisor watched it once and made a phone call. That phone call started a chain that ended in a small office in a building with no sign on the door. The footage was copied and the original was locked in an evidence safe. The footage opens with the hiker walking through heavy snow in near total darkness. The body cam had a built-in light, but it only reached about 15 feet ahead before the snowfall swallowed it. The audio picks up his breathing, steady but slightly elevated, and the crunch of his boots compressing fresh powder. He was moving through dense forest, black spruce mostly, the kind that grows tight and close together in that part of Alaska, and turns the woods into a maze after dark. For the first several minutes, nothing unusual happens. He walks. He stops occasionally, seems to look around, then continues. His breathing stays controlled. Around the 7-minute mark, he slows noticeably. The camera angle shifts as he tilts his head upward, and for a few seconds, the light catches snowflakes falling through the canopy. Then he stops completely. His breathing changes. It gets shallow and fast. The camera holds steady on the tree line ahead. About 40 feet out, just at the edge of where the light begins to fade, there is a shadow. It is not a tree. Trees do not move. This shadow shifts and adjusts, and then in one fluid motion rises to a height that puts it well above the surrounding brush. The outline is wrong for a bear, wrong for a moose. The proportions are upright, broad across the shoulders, narrow at the waist and far too tall. It stands there for maybe 2 seconds. Then the dogman turns and moves into the deeper forest with a speed that seems impossible for something that size. The audio captures a single phrase from the hiker. His voice is barely above a whisper and shaking badly. The words are hard to make out through the wind and the snow static, but audio enhancement later confirmed he was asking himself whether what he just saw was a wolf. The fear in his voice is unmistakable. 3 seconds after he speaks, the footage cuts. No fade, no static. Just a hard stop, as if someone pressed a button or the camera lost power instantaneously. That is the last recorded moment of his life that anyone has ever found. 14 minutes of footage ending in absolute nothing. The case sat in a regional file for 2 months before it got flagged by a small investigative unit that handled unusual disappearances in federal wilderness areas. The unit was unofficial in the way that many things in government are unofficial. It existed on paper as a subsection of a larger missing persons task force. In practice, it operated with a narrow focus on cases that did not fit standard explanations, cases where the evidence pointed somewhere that no official report could follow. 2 investigators were assigned. They arrived in Alaska in late January with authorization to review all case materials and conduct a follow-up ground search. The lead investigator had been with the unit for 9 years. He had worked dozens of cases across the western states, most involving hikers or hunters who vanished under circumstances that defied easy categorization. He was methodical and skeptical by nature, the kind of person who did not jump to conclusions but also did not ignore uncomfortable evidence. His partner was newer to the unit, maybe 3 years in, but had a background in forensic analysis that made her particularly useful in the field. They reviewed the footage together in a conference room at the ranger station before they ever set foot on the ground. The footage troubled them both, but for different reasons. The lead investigator focused on the shadow. He had seen enough trail camera footage and witness recordings over the years to recognize what he was looking at, even if he was not ready to say it out loud yet. His partner focused on the boot prints ending in the clearing with no exit tracks. That meant one of 2 things. Either the hiker was carried out by something strong enough to leave no ground trace while bearing his full weight, or something happened at that spot that current understanding could not explain. Neither option was comforting. Both options pointed in the same direction. They coordinated with 4 rangers from the local station, all experienced backcountry operators who knew the terrain. The rangers were told this was a routine follow-up investigation into the disappearance. They were not told about the footage. They were not told about the unit's actual focus. The investigators had learned long ago that sharing too much information too early tended to make people either dismissive or panicked. Neither reaction was helpful in the field. The team of 6 departed the trailhead at first light on a clear morning with temperatures hovering around 10 below zero. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs with every breath. The hike to the base camp took most of the morning. The trail had been buried under months of accumulated snow, and even with snowshoes the going was slow. The forest closed in quickly once they left the main drainage. Black spruce lined the route in dense walls, their branches heavy with snow and ice. The corridors between the trees felt more like tunnels than open woods. Sound traveled strangely in there. Voices carried farther than expected in some directions and died completely in others. The rangers moved with the casual efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times. The investigators moved with the quiet alertness of people who knew what might be waiting. About an hour in, the lead investigator noticed something that the rangers either missed or chose not to mention. The animal tracks along the trail had thinned to almost nothing. Earlier in the hike, they had crossed the prints of hares, foxes, and what looked like a wolverine. Now there was nothing. The snow was clean and undisturbed except for their own trail. In the wild, the absence of animals tells you more than their presence ever could. They reached the base campsite by midday. The tent was gone, collected during the initial search, but the clearing was still identifiable by the compressed snow and the food cache pole still standing among the trees. The investigators spread out and began a systematic examination of the surrounding area. They worked in expanding circles from the camp center, methodically scanning every trunk and drift and depression in the snow. The rangers watched with mild curiosity. To them, this ground had already been covered thoroughly. There was nothing left to find. They were wrong about that. The lead investigator found the first anomaly within an hour. About 200 yards north of the camp, on the trunk of a large spruce, there were claw marks, 5 parallel grooves running vertically down the bark, starting at a height of roughly 8 feet and dragging downward for about 3 feet. The grooves were deep, maybe half an inch into the wood, and spaced apart at a width that matched no bear species in the region. Black bears leave marks, and grizzlies leave bigger marks, but these were different. The spacing suggested a hand rather than a paw. The starting height meant whatever made them was tall enough to reach 8 feet while standing on flat ground. One of the rangers came over to look. He studied the marks for a long time without saying anything. Then he mentioned that he had seen similar marks on a patrol 2 seasons back about 6 miles east and had written them off as bear damage. He did not sound entirely convinced of his own explanation anymore. The investigator photographed the marks and took measurements without offering his own theory. He had learned that silence was more useful than speculation in moments like these. His partner knelt at the base of the tree and examined the snow around it, but found nothing. Whatever made the marks had not left prints, or the snow had covered them. They found more marks as they moved deeper into the forest, not just on one tree, but on several, spaced at irregular intervals along what appeared to be a path or a boundary line. Some of the marks were old, weathered, and partially healed over by new bark growth. Others were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and sharp-edged. The pattern suggested that something had been marking this territory for a long time, possibly years, refreshing the marks periodically the way an animal maintains the borders of its range. The investigators exchanged a look that the rangers did not catch. They had seen this kind of territorial marking before in other cases across other states. It always meant the same thing. By early afternoon, they reached the clearing where the hikers' boot prints had ended months before. The snow had been replenished many times since then, and no trace of the original prints remained. But the clearing itself had an unsettling quality that was hard to put into words. The trees around its edge were spaced too evenly, almost deliberately, and several of them bore the same vertical claw marks. The air felt different in that clearing, heavier, stiller. Even the rangers noticed it, though none of them said anything about it directly. In the center of the clearing, partially buried under snow, the lead investigator found a pile of bones. They were animal bones. Elk, by the look of them, though stripped so clean that identification was difficult. But it was not the bones themselves that stopped everyone cold. It was the way they were arranged, not scattered the way a predator would leave them after feeding, stacked deliberately, in a low mound with the largest bones on the bottom and smaller ones on top. The skull sat on top of the pile facing east. It was ritualistic, it was intentional, and it was deeply, fundamentally wrong in a way that made everyone in the clearing go quiet. One of the rangers asked if it could be a hunter's camp or some kind of indigenous site. The investigator shook his head slowly. The marks on the bones showed teeth, but not the teeth of any predator that would arrange its kills afterward. The bones had been cleaned by something with immense jaw strength and then placed with purpose. The lead investigator had seen bone piles like this twice before in his career, once in Michigan and once in the mountains of eastern Washington. Both times the cases had involved the same kind of creature. He did not share this with the group. He photographed the arrangement from every angle and moved on. The temperature dropped fast after that, the way it does in Alaska when the short winter day begins to fade. They had maybe 3 hours of usable light left. The plan had been to complete their survey and return to the trailhead before dark. That plan was already falling behind. The lead investigator made the call to push deeper toward the creek where the Bodycam had been found, knowing it would cut their margin thin. His partner disagreed quietly but followed. The rangers adjusted their pace without complaint. They were professionals. They trusted the plan even if the timeline was getting tight. The forest changed as they moved northwest toward the creek. The trees grew thicker and the canopy closed overhead until very little daylight reached the ground. The air temperature seemed to drop several degrees just from stepping under that canopy. Everything felt closer and darker. The snow between the trunks was disturbed in places. Large impressions that could have been anything but formed a loose trail heading in the same direction they were traveling. The impressions were big, much bigger than a wolf print, and they showed a stride length that suggested something moving on 2 legs rather than 4. The lead investigator stopped the group and crouched beside one of the impressions. He brushed away the top layer of loose powder and studied what remained underneath. The print was partially melted and refrozen, making detail difficult, but the shape was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. It was a footprint, a massive one, wider than a human foot and significantly longer, with what appeared to be claw marks extending from the toes. But the weight distribution was wrong for a biped of any known species. The pressure was heaviest at the ball and the toes, digitigrade, the way a dog or wolf walks. But the overall shape was humanoid. He did not explain any of this to the rangers. He simply noted it and moved on. His partner fell in step beside him and mentioned quietly that she had counted over 30 similar Dogman prints in the last quarter mile. They were either being tracked or following a trail that something wanted them to follow. Neither possibility was good. They found the creek around 3 in the afternoon with the light already going gold and flat. The water was frozen solid, a ribbon of white ice winding through the dark trees. The rock where the Bodycam had been recovered was easy to identify, a flat granite shelf jutting out from the bank. The investigators examined the area while the rangers spread out to secure a perimeter. It was standard procedure. Nobody said it was because they were nervous, but the spacing told the truth. The rangers were putting distance between themselves and the tree line, covering sight lines, moving with attention that had not been there that morning. The lead investigator found more claw marks on the trees near the creek. These were different from the earlier ones. They were lower, around waist height, and they were not vertical. They were horizontal, gouged into the bark in rough parallel lines that circled the trunk entirely, as if something had wrapped around the tree and squeezed. The bark was crushed in places, compressed inward with a force that had partially splintered the wood beneath. He ran his fingers along the grooves and felt the depth of them and tried very hard not to think about the kind of grip strength required to do this to a living tree. His partner called him over to the far side of the creek. She had found a second bone arrangement, smaller than the first but following the same pattern. Animal bones cleaned and stacked with the skull on top. This time it was a fox, small and delicate, but treated with the same deliberate care. Beside the bone pile, scratched into the frozen mud, were marks that looked like symbols. Not letters, not pictures, just patterns, geometric and repetitive. carved with claws into the hard ground. They meant nothing to anyone present, but their existence meant everything. Whatever lived out here was not just hunting, it was thinking. The lead investigator photographed every symbol and every bone. His partner took soil samples and measured the depth of the claw marks in the frozen mud. The work felt absurd in a way. Scientific method applied to something that science had no framework for. But the documentation mattered. It always mattered, because someday someone might need to know what was out here. And when that day came, the evidence would need to be clean and indisputable. The lead investigator stood up from the symbols and looked at the tree line. The light had shifted while they worked. Shadows had lengthened. The forest that had looked merely dark an hour ago now looked like something that was waiting. He checked his watch and felt a cold weight settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. The first ranger disappeared at 4:17 in the afternoon. Nobody saw it happen. One moment he was standing at the far end of the perimeter, maybe 60 yards from the main group, watching the tree line to the north. The next moment he was simply not there. No shout, no sound of struggle, no gunshot. His tracks in the snow led to a point between two large spruce trees and then ended, the same way the hiker's tracks had ended in the clearing months before. Just stopped, as if something had lifted him straight off the ground without leaving a single mark. The remaining rangers called out for him. Their voices echoed through the frozen forest and came back empty. The lead investigator grabbed the nearest ranger by the arm and told him to pull everyone in tight. No one goes anywhere alone. No one leaves line of sight. The ranger looked at him with the first real flicker of fear. They searched for 10 minutes and found nothing. No blood, no torn clothing, no tracks leading away. The snow was pristine. The forest was silent in a way that felt intentional, not quiet the way winter forests are normally quiet. This was the kind of silence that happens when every living thing in the area has either fled or gone completely still. The investigators knew that silence. They had heard it before in other forests, in other states, in other cases that ended with sealed files and official explanations that satisfied no one who had been there. The lead investigator looked at his partner and saw his own understanding reflected back at him. This was active. This was happening now. The light was failing fast. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees in the last hour, and the sky was going from pale gray to deep purple. They had perhaps 40 minutes before full dark. The trailhead was a 4-hour hike in good conditions. They were not going to make it out tonight. The lead investigator made the decision to establish a defensive position near the creek and wait for first light. It was the only reasonable choice. But the word reasonable felt hollow in a place where a ranger had just vanished without a sound or a trace. They chose a spot where the creek bank rose about 4 feet above the frozen water, giving them a wall on one side. A large deadfall of tangled spruce trunks covered another angle. It was not much, but it was better than sitting in the open. The lead investigator positioned each person deliberately, placing the armed rangers on the exposed flanks and keeping his partner close to the center. He had done this before, not here, not in Alaska, but the procedure was the same everywhere the Dogman hunted. They built no fire. The lead investigator was clear about this. No light, no smoke, nothing that would mark their position more than their presence already did. They huddled in a tight cluster between the creek bank and a deadfall that provided some cover on one side. The rangers had sidearms and one carried a rifle. The investigators were armed as well. None of them believed their weapons would make much difference based on what the evidence was telling them. But holding a gun provided a psychological anchor that nothing else could replace in that darkness. The sound started about 20 minutes after full dark. Not the sounds of wind or settling snow or the normal creaks of a frozen forest. These were footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the snow with a rhythm that was almost but not quite human. 2 legs, not 4. The first ranger to hear it raised his hand without speaking. Everyone went still. The sound was faint at first, easy to dismiss as imagination or the settling of a snowdrift, but it repeated, and again, each footfall landing with the weight of something far heavier than any person. The snow out there was deep, and whatever was walking through it was not sinking the way a human would. It was moving on top of the pack with a sureness that spoke of complete familiarity with this terrain. This was not a visitor. This was something that lived here, something that owned this ground. The stride was too long, and the pace was too steady, like something that didn't need to hurry, because it already knew exactly where its prey was sitting. The footsteps circled them, slowly at first, maintaining a distance of maybe 50 or 60 yards, just beyond the range where anyone could see anything in the darkness. Then they tightened. 40 yards, 30. The sound grew louder and more distinct. Each crunch of snow was accompanied by a faint secondary sound, a scraping like claws dragging lightly across the surface of the snowpack. The lead investigator sat very still and listened and counted the footfalls. He tried to determine how many dogmen were out there. His best estimate was 3, possibly 4, moving in a coordinated pattern around their position, maintaining equal spacing, never overlapping. The pattern was too organized to be coincidental. This was not random animal behavior, this was tactical. He had suspected dogmen from the claw marks and the bone arrangements and the tracks. Now the suspicion hardened into certainty. The dogmen moved like wolves but walked upright, and they hunted with a coordination that went beyond pack instinct into something that looked very much like strategy. He had read every file his unit possessed on dogman encounters. The pattern was always the same: territorial marking, bone totems, deliberate stalking, and then, when the dogman chose, overwhelming force applied so quickly that victims had no time to react or resist. The circling was part of it, psychological pressure before the physical strike. One of the rangers shifted position and a branch snapped under his knee. The circling stopped instantly. Every footstep ceased at the same moment as if controlled by a single mind. The silence that followed was absolute. The investigator could hear his own heartbeat. He could hear the ranger beside him breathing in short, tight gasps. Then from the darkness ahead and to the left came a sound that none of them had ever heard before. It was a vocalization, low and resonant, starting in a register that was almost too deep to hear and rising into a sustained note that vibrated in the chest cavity. It was not a howl. Wolves howl. This was something else entirely. It was a dogman call, directed and purposeful. It was answered immediately by a second dogman from the opposite side of their position, matching the pitch and duration exactly. Then a third from behind them. The calls overlapped and merged into a harmonic that seemed to come from everywhere at once and from nowhere at all. The second ranger disappeared during those calls. He had been sitting on the outer edge of the group, pressed against the deadfall. When the sound stopped and someone reached for him, he was gone. His rifle lay in the snow where he had been sitting. The shoulder strap was torn clean through, not cut. Torn, as if whatever grabbed him moved with such force and speed that the heavy fabric simply ripped. The snow where he had been showed a single long furrow leading into the darkness, as if he had been dragged. The furrow ran for about 10 feet and then disappeared. Tracks that led to nothing. The same pattern, always the same pattern. The remaining group pressed tighter together. They had started as 6. They were down to 4 now. 2 investigators and 2 rangers sitting in a circle with their backs to each other, and their weapons pointed out into a darkness that could have hidden anything. The lead investigator keyed his satellite communicator and sent an emergency extraction request with their coordinates. He marked it Priority 1. He knew that even with the fastest response, help was hours away, possibly not until dawn. They had to survive until then, and the dogmen were not showing any sign of losing interest. If anything, the disappearance of the second ranger seemed to have energized them. The circling resumed immediately. The dogmen moved closer now, maybe 20 yards out, close enough that the investigators could occasionally catch a glimpse of movement between the trees when thin moonlight filtered through the clouds. The shapes were tall, very tall. The Dogman moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for their size, weaving between the dense spruce trunks without a sound. Just once, one of the Dogmen stepped into a patch of moonlight, and the lead investigator saw it clearly for perhaps 2 seconds. The Dogman stood on 2 legs with a posture that was slightly forward-leaning, like something about to break into a sprint. The shoulders were massive and the arms hung long, reaching well past the knees. The head was canine but wrong, stretched and angular in ways that no wolf could account for. The snout was elongated, the ears pointed and erect, and even from 20 yards he could see the width of the jaw. The Dogman's body was covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. The Dogman turned its head and looked directly at the investigator. The eyes caught the moonlight and reflected it back with a pale amber glow that held intelligence and patience and something that looked almost like contempt. Then it stepped behind a tree and was gone. 2 seconds, that was all. But 2 seconds was enough to confirm everything the investigator had spent 9 years documenting. The third ranger went silent sometime around midnight. He was the oldest of the group, the veteran who had said he had never seen anything like the hiker's vanishing boot prints. He was sitting right next to the lead investigator's partner. She heard a soft sound like fabric sliding against bark. Then he was simply not there anymore. No cry, no struggle. His sidearm was still holstered on the ground where he had been. The holster was unbuckled, but the weapon had not been drawn. Whatever took him had moved so fast and so quietly that a man with over 2 decades of wilderness experience did not even have time to react. The investigator's partner was shaking now, not from the cold, though the temperature had fallen well below -20. She was shaking because the math had become very simple. They started with 6, they were down to 3. The Dogmen were taking them one at a time, picking off the edges, working inward. This was not random violence. This was a hunt being conducted by Dogmen that understood positioning and timing and the psychology of fear. They were patient, they were methodical, and they had the advantage of darkness and terrain and strength that no firearm in the group could match. The lead investigator made a decision. Staying put was death by attrition. Moving in darkness through unfamiliar terrain with Dogmen circling was also dangerous, but it introduced variables. Variables meant chances. He told the remaining ranger and his partner that they were moving toward the creek and following it downstream. Creeks lead to rivers. Rivers lead to drainages. Drainages lead to roads. It was the oldest rule in wilderness survival, and it was the only plan he had. They moved in a tight group with the ranger in front and the lead investigator bringing up the rear. The creek was only 30 yards away, but it felt like a mile. Every step crunched in the snow, and every crunch felt like a signal being broadcast into the dark. The Dogmen had stopped circling. The footsteps had ceased entirely. The forest was quiet again. That scared the investigator more than the sounds had. When predators go silent, it means they have stopped hunting and started positioning. They reached the creek and turned downstream. The ice was solid enough to walk on in most places, and the frozen surface was easier to move across than the deep powder in the forest. They moved fast, faster than was safe in the dark, stumbling over uneven ice and frozen rocks beneath the snow. Behind them, the investigator heard movement in the trees, not circling anymore, following, keeping pace, matching their speed exactly. The Dogmen were shadowing them through the forest on both sides of the creek, maintaining parallel tracks, staying hidden, but making just enough noise to let the group know they were there. Something large crossed the frozen creek behind them. A dark shape that covered the ice in 2 bounds and vanished into the trees on the other side. The Dogman moved so fast it was barely more than a blur of dark fur and long limbs against the white snow. The remaining ranger spun and raised his rifle, but there was nothing left to aim at. They ran, all pretense of measured movement abandoned. They ran down the frozen creek with their boots slipping on ice and their lungs burning in the sub-zero air. The forest blurred past on both sides. The investigator's partner fell once and he pulled her up without stopping. His fingers ached from gripping her jacket. The remaining ranger ran ahead, his longer stride putting distance between them. The investigator called after him to stay close, but the words came out as gasps. The cold air felt like breathing glass. Every inhale cut and every exhale trailed a cloud of vapor that hung in the still air behind them like breadcrumbs marking their path. The dogmen kept pace. The sounds in the trees matched their speed, sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, sometimes on both sides at once. They were being herded. The investigator knew it, but the direction the dogmen were pushing them was downstream, toward the drainage, toward the trailhead. That was the direction they needed to go. They burst out of the forest onto a wide gravel bar where the creek joined a larger stream. The tree line fell back and the sky opened up above them. Moonlight flooded the open ground, and for the first time in hours, they could see more than 10 feet in any direction. The cold air felt different out here, cleaner, less thick. The dogmen did not follow them into the open. The sounds in the trees stopped at the edge of the forest and did not continue. The investigator turned and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing showed itself. But he could feel the dogmen there, standing just inside the shadows, watching them go. The open gravel bar was maybe 200 yards wide. The group stood in the center of it, exposed under the moonlight, breathing hard and watching the dark wall of forest on every side. For a long time nobody moved. They just stood there listening. The silence from the tree line was total. No movement, no calls, no footsteps. Whatever calculation the dogmen had been running, whatever decision process governed their hunt, the answer had come back as release rather than pursuit. The survivors were being allowed to leave. They had chosen to let the survivors go, the same way they had let the hiker's bodycam be found, the same way they left bone piles and claw marks and tracks that told a story no official would ever believe. It was not mercy, it was a message. Come into our territory, and this is what happens. Tell others. Keep them away. The lead investigator and his partner and the remaining ranger reached the trailhead at dawn. An extraction team was already staging there, triggered by the satellite emergency message. The ranger collapsed against a vehicle and did not move for a long time. The investigator's partner sat on the tailgate of a truck and stared at the tree line with hollow eyes. The lead investigator walked to the edge of the parking area and looked back at the forest. The trees stood dark and dense and perfectly still in the early morning light. Steam rose from the snow where the first sun touched it. It looked peaceful. It looked like any other stretch of Alaskan wilderness. He stood there until someone called him back. Then he turned away and began closing the case. The 3 missing rangers were officially listed as victims of exposure and predation by wolves. The bodies were never recovered. The investigation report noted that extreme cold and predator activity made recovery impossible and inadvisable. Nobody pushed back on the explanation. Nobody asked the questions that needed asking. The families of the missing rangers received flags and condolence letters that praised their service in vague, careful language. The letters said nothing about dogmen or bone totems or claw marks 8 feet up a tree trunk. They said nothing about vanishing boot prints or the sound of something circling in the dark on 2 legs. The official story was wolves and weather, and the official story was all that would ever be released. The hiker's case was closed as well. Cause of death listed as likely hypothermia complicated by animal encounter. The bodycam footage was classified and archived in a facility that does not appear on any public directory. The bone arrangements, the claw marks, the dogman tracks, the symbols carved into the frozen ground, all documented, photographed, catalogued, and sealed. The lead investigator filed his actual report with his unit and watched it disappear into the same system that had absorbed every other report like it over the years. He noted in his personal log that the Alaskan case matched dogman behavioral patterns documented in Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Pacific Northwest. Territorial marking, coordinated hunting, deliberate intimidation followed by selective predation. The dogmen were consistent across geography. They operated by the same rules everywhere they were encountered. Mark the territory. Warn the intruders. Take them one by one if the warnings were ignored. And always leave survivors, because survivors carry the fear outward and fear keeps others from coming back. The remaining ranger transferred to a desk position in Anchorage 2 weeks after the incident. He never returned to the backcountry. The investigator's partner requested reassignment to a different unit and received it within a month. She never spoke about what happened in those woods publicly. The lead investigator stayed with his unit and added the case to his growing files. He marked the location on a private map that he kept in a locked drawer. A map that was slowly filling with pins across the northern and western states. Each pin representing a place where the same pattern had played out, with the same impossible creatures and the same official silence afterward. The pins were getting closer together in some regions. That worried him more than any single case. The investigator sometimes sat alone in his office after hours and looked at that map. He traced the clusters with his finger and tried to understand what they meant. Were the dogmen spreading, or were they simply being documented more often? Were they growing bolder, or had they always been this active and nobody had survived to report it until recently? The questions multiplied and the answers stayed locked behind the tree lines of a dozen states. He never went back to that stretch of Alaskan wilderness. Nobody from his unit ever did. The trailhead was eventually closed for what the Forest Service called infrastructure maintenance. The closure has been renewed every year since then. No maintenance has ever been performed. The trail is growing over and the signs are fading. And somewhere in a locked archive, 14 minutes of Bodycam footage sits in a file that no one is authorized to open. It ends the same way every time. A shadow standing tall between the trees, a terrified voice asking if what he just saw was a wolf. It was not a wolf. It was never a wolf. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.